Elise Russell, my dear, what's our next subtopic? Snap to it, girl.
Is the election right of 1892?
You might be right. Who's our president right now, Elise?
Isn't it Harrison?
Better way, Benjamin Harrison. Atta girl, yeah. Ready to go today, ready to go. All right, we're talking about the election of 1892, because that's what Alexa wants to do. I can't rhyme. I'm on it today. Now, during the election of 1892, we're going to have 3 political parties involved, because we've had so much controversy over different parties. So there will be 3 political parties involved. We'll have the Republican Party involved, then we'll have the Democratic Party involved, but we're also going to have the Populist Party. It's going to be a new political party, the Populist Party. And all 3 are going to nominate candidates for the presidency. So we'll have the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and the Populist Party. Now the Republican Party has enough confidence in President Harrison that they will nominate him for re-election. So Benjamin Harrison will try to run for a 2nd term, and he will be the Republican Party nominee in 1892. The Democratic Party goes back to a former president, Grover Cleveland, who served as president prior to Benjamin Harrison. And he will be the Democratic nominee for president, former President Grover Cleveland. The Populist Party nominated a man by the name of James B. Weaver. Anybody in here do their paper on James B. Weaver? I know that Leighton Kittleman did. James B. Weaver was the Populist Party candidate in 1892. And the Populist Party was organized and formed by farmers. The Populist Party was organized and formed by American farmers. Now normally, when a new party comes in, and the last time this happened was when Ross Perot came in and ran as an independent. Actually, we had an independent candidate in the last election, but the guy never went out and campaigned much. But when Ross Perot became an independent, he ran when George H.W. Bush was running for re-election, and when Bill Clinton was running for his 1st term. Ross Perot jumped in that election, and he did very well, and he turned the election in Clinton's favor because those Republicans that were disappointed in the Republican Party voted for Ross Perot, which gave, in essence, Clinton more votes, if you think about it, and it gave Bill Clinton the president. But even in that election, Ross Perot gained no electoral votes. So it's very unusual if a populist candidate or a 3rd party candidate, they can affect an election, but very seldom do they ever get any electoral votes. Well, in this particular election, Cleveland wins the election by a fairly large margin. He had 277 electoral votes. Former President Cleveland had 277 electoral votes, and Harrison only had 145, which was kind of a poor showing for a sitting president. So Grover Cleveland wins this election of 1892. He has 277 electoral votes, and Harrison had 145. So Grover Cleveland becomes the 24th President of the United States and the 1st former president to be elected non-consecutively. So he's actually the 22nd president and the 24th president. That's why it's a little, if you count presidents, you have 1 less president than you do numbers. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, the point I wanted to make here is James B. Weaver and the Populist Party did very well. They actually gathered in 22 electoral votes and over 1 million popular votes. So there was no question that the people that probably would have voted for Harrison in this election threw their votes to Weaver. So those Republican farmers, what did they do? Voted for Weaver. What did Democratic farmers do? Probably a lot of them voted for Cleveland. You know what I mean? But some, I'm sure, voted, in essence, for Weaver. But the farmer vote made a big difference in this, And because of the Populist Party and James B. Weaver, Grover Cleveland is elected in kind of an upset victory over President Harrison. Now, listen to this. What's key again? What is Cleveland hoping happens in Congress during this election? That's controlled by his political party, the Democrats, and it did. It made a flip, and the Congress was now going to be controlled by Democrats, which is going to be a good thing for President Cleveland. So we've got former President Grover Cleveland, now the 24th President of the United States. And because nothing too eventful happened during that time, we're going to jump right to the election of 1896. Election of 1896. Now, let me ask you this question. Could Grover Cleveland have run again? Yeah, because the amendment to the Constitution that limited a president's terms, Dwight D. Eisenhower was the first one affected by that. But Cleveland had had enough. He did not want to run for re-election. So the Democrats selected a congressman from Nebraska by the name of William Jennings Bryan. You know that? Yeah, that's your guy. What was the significance about him running for president? I think you remember, Andy, that was a little unusual. What did he have? What was his situation was unusual from others? William Jennings Bryan.
He got nominated by two parties.
Well, he did. We'll talk about that. But how old was he? Did you catch that part? The time of his nomination, yeah.
Where's this guy from again?
Well, I usually repeat these many times, so just focus in, girl. Yeah, I'll give it to you again, okay?
Okay.
Okay, he was a congressman from Nebraska. So the Democrats selected Congressman William Jennings Bryan from Nebraska. And the key to his situation is he was only 36 years old. That's pretty young. Anybody know how old you have to run for president?
35.
35. So he was just a year older than the minimum. Okay? So the Democrats select Congressman William Jennings Bryan from Nebraska as their candidate. At the time of his nomination, he was only 36 years old. And his running mate for the vice presidency is going to be Arthur Sewell of Maine. Arthur Sewell of Maine will be his running mate. So for the Democratic ticket, because President Cleveland does not want to seek another term, the Democrats select Congressman William Jennings Bryan from Nebraska. He is only 36 years old, and his running mate for the vice presidency will be Arthur Sewell of Maine. The Republicans choose William McKinley as their candidate for the presidency. Republicans choose William McKinley. And he, like many of these presidential nominees we've talked about, are from what state? What state keeps coming up all the time? Not Virginia. Ohio. A lot of them from Ohio. And McKinley had served in the House of Representatives from Ohio, and also served as governor of Ohio. So he had a lot of political experience. So the Republican Party chooses William McKinley as their candidate for the presidency. He was from Ohio and had served in both the House of Representatives in Ohio and also served as governor of Ohio. His running mate for the vice presidency will be Garrett Hobart of New Jersey. Garrett Hobart of New Jersey. So here's your presidential battlefield for 1896. Republicans choose William McKinley as their candidate for the presidency. He's from Ohio. He had served in both the House of Representatives and as governor of Ohio. His running mate for vice president will be Garrett Hobart of New Jersey. The Democrats selected Congressman William Jennings Bryan from Nebraska as their nominee. He was only 36 years old at the time, and his running mate for the vice presidency will be Arthur Sewell of Maine. Now, it's kind of interesting when you go back to the Republican side, the vice presidential nominee, Garrett Hobart, had never been elected to any office in his life prior to this. Never even ran for political office, which was a little bit unusual. So McKinley's running mate for vice president, Garrett Hobart of New Jersey, had not been elected to any office or ran for any office prior to running for Vice President of the United States. Now, is the Populist Party still in the game? They are. And they nominate a fellow by the name of Tom Watson for the vice presidency. Who do they nominate for the presidency? William Jennings Bryan. So it's kind of interesting. William Jennings Bryan not only got nominated by the Democratic Party, he also got nominated by the Populist Party, and he chose a different running mate in that particular party, a guy by the name of Tom Watson of Georgia. So all these elections, the point I'm making with these elections, they all have their weird quirks. Every one of them has something weird about it, you know what I mean? And so this was a weird one too, because the Populist Party also nominated William Jennings Bryan for president, but they chose Tom Watson of Georgia for the vice presidency. So you have three political parties, two different presidential candidates, and three different vice presidential candidates. Now, you would think that that would help the Populist Party because it would get you the what? What type of vote? Come on, who's in the Populist Party? Who made up that party? Farmers, okay? It would seem that that would be a big advantage if one candidate got nominated by two parties, more than likely. Didn't work out. When the smoke cleared, McKinley had collected 271 electoral votes, and Bryan had 176, which included him running on two parties. So that was kind of odd. So when the smoke cleared, William McKinley collected 271 electoral votes, compared to that of William Jennings Bryan's 176, and William McKinley becomes the nation's 25th President of the United States. So again, when the smoke cleared, McKinley collected 271 electoral votes, Bryan 176, which included, if you kind of pick it out, from two different parties, okay? So he might have won, people might have voted for him. When you vote for people, do you have to vote for the same person for president, vice president? You don't get to split them up, do you? So some people voted for he and who? Okay, well, some did on the Populist Party voted for him and Tom Watson. They also voted for him and who? Arthur Sewell. But you see what I mean? They gained those electoral votes from two different elections. Well, at the end of the election of 1896, the Populist Party kind of went out. Okay, they were done. Populist Party fizzled out after this election. Now the next subtopic gets us away from presidential elections and talks about something that's kind of ironic. And the subtopic is trouble in Cuba. Trouble in Cuba. McKenna, my dear, if I said to you Cuba, what would you know about Cuba? I mean in general. And what I might mean by that is, what is the relationship? Where is Cuba? What's the United States' relationship with Cuba? What do you know about Cuba? You know where it's at? Geographically? Have an idea? We've got to get a geography class back in here.
90 miles southeast before.
Yeah, it's 90 miles off the coast of Key West, Florida, so it's in the Caribbean, okay? And what type of country is it? Shh. What type of country is Cuba? Communist country. We have a communist country 90 miles off the coast of the United States. So what's our relationship presently with Cuba? Not good. And when was the worst time in history our relationship with Cuba? During the Cold War, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which you'll learn next year. The ironic thing about this is at this time in history in 1896, we are feeling sorry for Cuba. We are going to go help Cuba. And our help in Cuba is going to result in what we know as the Spanish-American War. So when you think about our relationship with Cuba now and our relationship in the past with Fidel Castro, right? We almost had a nuclear war over Cuba in 1962. But at this time in history, Cuba was a concern for us in a positive way. Now, when you look back at history, the only two remnants of Spain's mighty empire in the Americas in 1896 were Cuba and Puerto Rico. They were the only two countries that Spain controlled anymore in the Western Hemisphere. Remember the big Remember the big empire Spain had, along with Britain and France in the New World, way back? Well, the only thing left that Spain owned in the New World were the countries of Cuba and Puerto Rico at this time. Okay? Now in 1868, now this is well before this election of 1896, obviously, we're going back. In 1868, a revolution broke out in Cuba. A revolution broke out in Cuba. And Peyton, why does a revolution break out in a country? They're mad at the leadership. That's exactly right. So way back in 1868, because of the way that the country of Spain was treating Cuba and the government, they had a revolt. And it took Spain 10 years to crush that uprising. 10 years. So from 1868 to 1878, there was a revolution in Cuba against the Spanish rule. And it took Spain 10 years to put down that revolution. Well, the discontent continued, and it was like a smoldering fire. They put out the fire, but they didn't get all the sparks, right? And it just kept smoldering and smoldering and smoldering. People there felt that they were being given starvation wages. There was wealthy landowners there that were not giving them their well due. And because of this anger and this smoldering smoke that kept going, they had another revolution in 1895. So from 1878 to 1895, you just had really tense relations after the first revolt. But finally in 1895, the Cubans revolted again. And the Spaniards responded not very nicely. Okay? So what the Spaniards did when the second revolt came is they put Cubans in concentration camps. They treated them horribly. Horribly. I think their philosophy was, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. We're not putting up with the second revolution. And so they just hammered them. They put them in concentration camps, treated them almost like slaves. Large areas of Cuba were reduced to utter ruin. Starvation and disease plagued the land. It was a miserable place to live during this second revolution. Cities were setting in ruin. Starvation and disease plagued the land. And who was paying attention? The United States of America. And what were they comparing this poor treatment to in our own history? Prior to the Revolutionary War, they kept in their minds, reminding themselves, hey, this reminds us of our own struggle for freedom during the American Revolution. So what did the United States do? They got involved. But who gets you involved in crap? Who puts that stuff out there to get people? Yeah, that's exactly right. And there were two newspapers that were very sympathetic to the Cuban cause. And they were the New York Journal and the New York World. Two of the biggest newspapers in the country at the time who took a sympathetic view towards Cuba. They began to print articles about how poorly the people of Cuba were being treated. Again, the New York Journal, I think it's on your ID sheet, isn't it? And the New York World. Both started sympathizing with the Cubans and began to get that out in the media. And when they get that out in the media, who does that affect? People. And people in the United States began to insist, you know what, America? We have the moral obligation or responsibility to try to help these people out. They're being treated poorly, and they were being treated horribly. So many people in the United States, after reading these articles, especially in the New York Journal and the New York World, insisted that America had the moral responsibility of trying to restore order in Cuba and getting those people a better life. What's that going to take to do that, probably? War. And troops and possibly a war. Well, what do you think President McKinley's statement was on that? He was inaugurated on March 4th, 1897, right in the middle of this thing. Again, he was inaugurated on March 4th, 1897. He's inaugurated on March 4th, 1897, right in the middle of this controversy, and obviously he's going to have an opinion on it after he becomes president, after his inauguration. What's his view on it? Is he going to support a possible conflict to free Cuba or not? No, he opposes it. Yeah, he opposes it. He strongly opposes any war. So when William McKinley was inaugurated on March 4th, 1897, he strongly opposed war. Well, on February 9th of 1898, there was a headline in all American major newspapers, and it was a letter written by the Spanish minister to the United States. Okay? Again, picture this in your mind. The major newspapers in America on February 9th, 1898, printed a letter that was written by the Spanish minister to the United States. February 9th, 1898, American newspapers printed a letter written by the Spanish minister of the United States. What's that mean? Have we got into that much, a Spanish minister of the United States? Do we have a Russian minister to the United States that lives in America and represents Russia with our government? We have them from all over. Matter of fact, when I take you to Georgetown next year, the embassy from Ukraine is there. And the guy that's the American or the Ukrainian representative to the United States lives there. They're all over the place. Every country sends somebody to America to kind of, support their country. Well, it just so happened that the Spanish minister of the United States wrote this letter. And it wasn't very kind. He referred to President McKinley as, quote, he